You filthy old man!
Ashbourne Manor fell silent. Footmen stopped carrying polished trunks. Ladies froze halfway down their carriage steps. Even the horses seemed to sense something had changed. Lady Cecilia Ashbourne stood at the foot of the grand staircase, one hand gathering the skirts of her ivory morning gown. Before her stood a weary old beggar. His patched wool coat hung from tired shoulders. His boots were cracked with age. A weathered walking stick trembled lightly in his hand. Moments earlier, he had tried to move aside as Lady Cecilia's carriage rolled into the courtyard. His worn sleeve had brushed the hem of her gown. Nothing more. The old man immediately bowed his head. "My deepest apologies, my lady." Lady Cecilia stared at him as though something unclean had wandered onto her father's estate. "You dare touch me." The old man said nothing. "You have soiled my gown." A nervous silence spread through the courtyard. Guests looked at one another. No one spoke. Then, Lady Cecilia slowly removed one immaculate white kid glove. The old man remained perfectly still. Without warning, smack, the glove struck his face. The sound echoed against the stone walls of Ashbourne Manor. A maid gasped. One elderly gentleman instinctively stepped forward, then quietly stopped. No one wished to challenge the future Viscountess of Ravenshire. The old man neither flinched nor protested. He simply lowered his eyes once more. "I meant no offense." His calmness only seemed to anger her further. "You should be grateful I used my glove." She looked down at his walking stick. Then, with the pointed toe of her satin slipper, and she nudged it. The stick rolled across the courtyard. Once, twice, until it came to rest beneath another carriage. A few guests laughed softly. The old man watched it for a moment, then began walking after it. One slow step, another. Every movement betrayed his age. Every step made the silence heavier. Dozens of people watched. Not one offered to help. But before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time you found today's story. Because before this day was over, one cruel decision would destroy an engagement, change the future of House Ravenshire, and teach everyone at Ashbourne Manor that true nobility can never be purchased. The old man finally reached his walking stick. Just as he bent to retrieve it, another hand reached it first. A young woman, quietly dressed, without jewels, without fanfare. Miss Eleanor Hartwell brushed the dust from the polished wood before placing it gently back into his hands. "I believe this is yours." The old man looked at her, not with surprise, with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell." She offered him a small smile. "I hope your day improves." "So do I." For a brief moment, the noise of the courtyard disappeared. The Duke silently memorized her face. She had not seen a beggar. She had seen an elderly man who needed kindness. Lady Cecilia watched the exchange with open disapproval. "Eleanor," the younger woman turned. "You waste your sympathy." Eleanor answered gently. "My mother taught me that kindness is never wasted." Lady Cecilia laughed. "My mother taught me quite the opposite." Lady Margaret Ashbourne appeared beside her daughter with practiced elegance. "What is delaying everyone?" "A beggar wandered into the courtyard," one guest explained. Lady Margaret spared the old man a single glance. "See that he is removed before his grace arrives." The servants nodded immediately. The household sprang back into motion. Florists adjusted towering arrangements of white roses. Footmen polished brass railings already shining in the morning sun. Kitchen maids hurried across the entrance hall carrying silver trays. Everything had to be perfect. Today, the Duke of Ravenshire was expected. One of England's oldest and most respected noblemen. A man whose name alone commanded instant respect throughout the kingdom. No one suspected. The Duke had already arrived. Not in a grand carriage, not beneath the Ravenshire banner, but wearing patched wool, leaning upon an old walking stick, watching, listening, waiting. His Grace Duke Edmund Ravenshire had heard troubling whispers about the woman his only son intended to marry. Others urged him simply to forbid the match. He refused. Character should never be judged by rumor, only by conduct. So he had come alone, without title, without servants, without privilege. If Lady Cecilia possessed true grace, she would show it to someone who could offer her nothing. If she did not, the truth would reveal itself. It already had. The distant rumble of carriage wheels broke his thoughts. Another coach rolled through the gates. This one bore the Ravenshire crest. Guests smiled with recognition. "The Viscount has arrived." Lady Cecilia's expression transformed instantly. The irritation vanished. Warmth replaced it as effortlessly as an actress changing costumes. Viscount Julian Ravenshire stepped onto the gravel, tall, handsome, kind-eyed, every inch the gentleman. "Cecilia," she hurried into his embrace. "I feared the roads had delayed you." They tried. He kissed her hand. "You look beautiful." The guests smiled approvingly. Lady Margaret looked quietly satisfied. Everything appeared exactly as she had planned. Julian greeted the assembled guests before walking toward the manor beside Cecilia. As they crossed the courtyard, they passed within only a few feet of the old beggar. Julian barely looked at him, an elderly stranger, nothing more. He did not recognize the familiar eyes. He did not recognize the steady patience. He did not recognize his own father. Edmund Ravenshire watched his son disappear through the great doors of Ashbourne Manor. He felt no anger, only sadness. His test had not truly begun when Lady Cecilia raised her hand. It began the moment his own son walked past him, without seeing the truth standing right before his eyes. The old beggar did not leave. That surprised everyone. Most men would have fled after such humiliation. Most men would have cursed the house that had rejected them. He did neither. Instead, he quietly accepted the stable master's reluctant permission to rest in a small corner of the servants' quarters until evening. "He'll be gone before nightfall," the stable master muttered, "as long as he keeps out of sight." The old man bowed politely. "You have my gratitude." No one questioned why his voice carried such quiet dignity. No one wondered why gratitude came so naturally to a man with so little. They simply returned to preparing for the grand weekend. Ashbourne Manor had far more important guests to impress, or so they believed. The manor pulsed with activity. Footmen hurried through polished corridors carrying trunks. Housemaids dusted portraits that had already been dusted twice. Fresh flowers filled every drawing room with the scent of roses and lavender. Silver gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Lady Margaret Ashbourne inspected everything with the precision of a military commander. No fingerprints. She ran a white glove across a polished table. "Replace these lilies," she frowned at a footman, "and tell the kitchen that luncheon will be served precisely at 1. Nothing escaped her attention. Nothing, except character. From the narrow window of the servants' quarters, the old beggar watched quietly. He had spent nearly 70 years among dukes, ministers, bishops, and kings. He had attended royal banquets, negotiated estates, settled disputes that shaped entire counties. Yet he had learned one lesson above all others. People revealed themselves most honestly when they believed no one important was watching. Today, no one believed he mattered. That was precisely why he had come. Upstairs, Lady Cecilia admired herself in a tall French mirror. The ivory gown had already been replaced by pale blue silk. A maid carefully fastened pearls around her neck. "Tighter," the maid obeyed. "Not that tight." The frightened girl immediately loosened the clasp. Lady Cecilia sighed dramatically. "Must I do everything myself?" I beg your pardon, my lady." "You always do." The maid lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." Lady Cecilia waved her away. "If apologies created competence, you would be remarkable." The young servant hurried from the room, blinking back tears. Lady Cecilia never looked after her. She simply admired the reflection staring back at her. Beauty had always opened doors. Soon, a title would open the rest. Downstairs, Miss Eleanor Hartwell noticed the maid slipping into the corridor. "Emily?" The girl quickly wiped her face. "I'm quite well, Miss Hartwell. You've been crying." Emily forced a smile. "It was nothing." Eleanor gently touched her arm. "It is never nothing." The words alone were enough. Emily's composure broke. "I cannot seem to please Lady Cecilia." Eleanor reached for a folded handkerchief. "You are not expected to be perfect." The maid accepted it gratefully. "You are expected to keep trying." Emily nodded. "Thank you, miss." Eleanor smiled softly. "We all need kindness on difficult days." Neither woman noticed the old beggar watching from the open courtyard beyond. He saw everything, not merely what Eleanor said, but how she said it. There was no performance, no audience to impress, only genuine compassion. The Duke quietly remembered another name, Emily. Luncheon approached. Guests filled the drawing room with cheerful conversation. Politics, horses, London gossip, the coming engagement. Everywhere Lady Cecilia walked, she became the picture of perfect refinement. She laughed gracefully. listened attentively, complimented elderly ladies, praised gentlemen's accomplishments. More than one guest remarked how fortunate Viscount Julian must feel, the Duke observed from a distance. Two faces, one for society, another for those beneath it. The contrast grew sharper with every passing hour. Behind the kitchens, reality looked very different. Cook balanced 3 steaming pots at once. Scullery maids scrubbed mountains of dishes. Footmen rushed trays between corridors. The air shimmered with heat. One exhausted kitchen maid stumbled. A silver platter slipped from her hands. It crashed loudly across the stone floor. Silence followed. Lady Cecilia had entered unnoticed. She stared at the scattered pieces. Unbelievable. The trembling girl immediately dropped to her knees. "I'm terribly sorry, my lady." "Sorry?" Lady Cecilia folded her arms. "That platter belonged to my grandmother. I didn't mean. Meaning well has never repaired silver." The young maid struggled to gather the pieces with shaking hands. Lady Cecilia turned toward the housekeeper. "Deduct the cost from her wages." The girl looked up in horror. "My lady, please." Lady Cecilia walked away without another glance. Her silk skirts barely whispered across the floor. Moments later, someone knelt beside the frightened maid. It was Eleanor. "You've cut your hand." The girl looked down. A thin line of blood traced her palm. "I shall fetch bandages." "No." Eleanor removed her own handkerchief. She carefully wrapped the injured hand herself. "It will hold until we reach the kitchen." The maid began crying again. "I'm so clumsy." Eleanor shook her head. "No." She smiled gently. "You're tired. There is a difference." The frightened girl managed a small smile. The Duke saw it all. A woman did not reveal her heart only in grand sacrifices. Sometimes, it appeared in the quiet way she wrapped another person's wounded hand. As afternoon drifted toward evening, Eleanor quietly slipped away carrying a small basket, fresh bread, a wedge of cheese, warm broth. She crossed the gardens until she reached the small bench beside the stable yard. The old beggar looked up as she approached. "I feared you had forgotten me. I could never forget someone who has nowhere warm to eat." She handed him the basket. "And I brought a blanket." He looked genuinely surprised. "You continue to trouble yourself for a stranger. I would hope someone would do the same for my father." The words lingered between them. "My parents are gone." She lowered her eyes. "But kindness should not disappear with them." The Duke accepted the food carefully. "I have attended banquets where men spoke endlessly of honor." He looked at the simple loaf of bread. "Today, I have found more honor inside this basket." Eleanor laughed quietly. "I fear the bread deserves most of the credit." "The bread fills the stomach." He smiled warmly. "Compassion feeds something far rarer." For several peaceful moments, neither spoke. Birdsong floated across the gardens. The afternoon sun painted golden light across the old stone walls. Finally, the Duke noticed a tear running along the sleeve of his patched coat. Eleanor noticed it too. "May I?" He looked down. "My sleeve?" She nodded. "It will catch on the fabric." From a small sewing pouch hidden within her basket, she produced a needle and thread. "You carry these with you," she smiled. "One never knows what might need mending." He removed the coat without hesitation. She stitched quietly, each movement careful, each stitch almost invisible. The Duke watched her work, not because of the coat, because patience revealed character more honestly than conversation. When she finished, she handed it back. "There, it looks almost new. It merely looks cared for." The Duke slowly put it on, then asked the question he had been quietly carrying all day. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell." She looked up. "Why do you continue helping a poor old beggar?" She answered without the slightest pause. "Because a person's worth should never depend upon how they are dressed." Silence settled between them. The breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted from the manor. The Duke's eyes softened. There it was. The answer he had unknowingly traveled across England to find. Not spoken from a ballroom, not delivered in a drawing room, but beneath an old oak tree, by a young woman expecting nothing in return. He inclined his head. "The world would be kinder if more people believed as you do." Eleanor smiled. "I think the world already could be." She rose. "I should return before Lady Cecilia notices I've disappeared. I'm grateful." "You owe me nothing." "I believe," the old man replied gently, "I owe you more than you realize." She offered one final smile before walking back toward the manor. The Duke watched until she disappeared beyond the rose garden. Only then did he whisper softly to himself, What truly makes a duchess? For the first time since beginning his journey, he believed he had found the answer. That evening, candles glowed throughout Ashbourne Manor. Music drifted from the drawing room. Guests toasted the future. Lady Cecilia shone beneath the chandeliers like the perfect lady society believed her to be. Across the room, Viscount Julian Ravenshire watched her with quiet admiration. Then, his attention shifted. Only for a moment, he noticed Eleanor comforting the same frightened kitchen maid he had seen earlier. She spoke softly. The maid smiled through tired eyes. The moment lasted only seconds, yet something about Eleanor's quiet kindness lingered in Julian's thoughts longer than Lady Cecilia's polished smile. He could not explain why. Neither could the Duke. Not yet. But somewhere beneath the glittering chandeliers of Ashbourne Manor, the first invisible crack had appeared in an engagement everyone believed was unbreakable. Morning arrived quietly. Mist drifted across the gardens of Ashbourne Manor. The dew still clung to the roses. Songbirds greeted the dawn from ancient oaks that had stood longer than anyone living could remember. From the windows, Ashbourne Manor looked peaceful, almost perfect, but appearances had become the house's greatest talent, and His Grace Duke Edmund Ravenshire had come precisely to look beyond them. Still disguised as a weary old beggar, he rose from the narrow cot in the servants' quarters. The patched coat Eleanor had mended rested neatly beside him. Her careful stitches had held through the night. He ran his fingers across the repaired sleeve, a simple act of kindness. Yet somehow, it carried more worth than every polished chandelier hanging inside the manor. The household awoke long before the guests. Kitchen fires crackled to life. Footmen polished silver until it reflected like mirrors. Housemaids hurried through endless corridors carrying fresh linens. The old beggar quietly offered to help carry firewood. The stablemaster looked surprised. "You needn't trouble yourself," the old man smiled. "An idle pair of hands often grows heavier than a bundle of wood." The stablemaster chuckled. If only some gentleman thought the same. Together, they carried the logs toward the kitchens. No one noticed. No one thanked him. The Duke had expected nothing else. Inside the breakfast room, Lady Cecilia looked radiant. Morning sunlight danced across her pale blue silk gown. Every curl rested perfectly. Every smile appeared effortless. Julian could scarcely take his eyes from her. "You slept well?" he asked warmly. "Perfectly. And your mother?" Lady Margaret looked up from her tea. "We have every reason to be pleased." She smiled graciously. "The Duke arrives tomorrow." Julian nodded. "My father dislikes grand welcomes." Lady Cecilia laughed softly. "I should hope even a duke enjoys a little admiration." Julian smiled. "You shall discover that father prefers sincerity." Lady Margaret exchanged the briefest glance with her daughter. It lasted less than a second. The Duke happened to witness it through the open terrace doors while sweeping fallen leaves nearby. Tiny moments often revealed enormous truths. Later that morning, guests wandered through the gardens. Some admired the fountains. Others discussed investments. Several gentlemen debated Parliament. The old beggar moved quietly among the hedges, trimming dead branches at the gardener's request. Invisible, ignored, exactly as he intended. Then, voices drifted from the rose arbor. Lady Cecilia, Lady Margaret. The Duke paused behind a tall yew hedge, not hiding, simply continuing his work. Neither woman noticed him. "I cannot endure another week of pretending," Cecilia sighed. Lady Margaret lowered her parasol. "You shall not have to. I grow weary of smiling at everyone." "Smile a little longer." Cecilia folded her arms. "Julian is kind, but kindness alone does not build dynasties." Lady Margaret's voice remained calm. "It is his title that matters. The Ravenshire estates, the influence, the future." Cecilia looked toward the manor. "I suppose marriage is a small price." Lady Margaret smiled faintly. "Affection fades." She adjusted one of Cecilia's gloves. "Titles survive." The words settled heavily in the morning air. The Duke continued trimming a rosebush. His hands never stopped moving. Neither woman suspected the elderly gardener several yards away had heard every word. He did not interrupt. He did not reveal himself. He simply listened, patiently. Every whisper confirmed another piece of the truth. Not far away, Julian searched the gardens for Cecilia. Instead, he found Eleanor seated beneath an oak tree. A small leather-bound book rested in her lap. She looked up as he approached. "My lord, I hope I'm not disturbing you." She smiled. Books rarely object to interruptions. Julian laughed. What are you reading? She turned the cover toward him. A collection of poems. I confess, I know very little poetry. Most gentlemen admit that only after quoting it incorrectly. He laughed again. I shall remember that. For several minutes, they spoke of literature, not romance, not society, simply books, history, travel, ideas. Conversation flowed without effort. Julian found himself smiling more than he expected. Then Lady Cecilia called from across the gardens. Julian! Her voice instantly broke the moment. I should go. Eleanor closed her book. So should I. Neither realized how naturally they had spoken together. Neither noticed the Duke observing quietly from across the lawn. Not romance. Not yet. Only comfort. Sometimes, that was where lasting affection began. The afternoon brought another opportunity. Lady Cecilia dismissed several maids after luncheon. I asked for fresh roses. One frightened servant spoke timidly. My lady, these were freshly cut. They are already beginning to open. That is what roses do. Lady Cecilia stared at her. Are you correcting me? No, my lady. Then replace them. The maid hurried away. Lady Cecilia sighed dramatically. Incompetence follows me everywhere. The old beggar happened to be sweeping nearby. She barely acknowledged his existence. To her, he was no more significant than the broom in his hands. The Duke quietly observed. Cruelty had become effortless. That concerned him more than anger ever could. Kind people occasionally lost patience. Proud people made impatience a habit. Toward evening, rain clouds gathered above the estate. A cool breeze swept across the grounds. Servants hurried indoors carrying garden furniture. The first drops began falling. The old beggar remained outside collecting forgotten tools. As he lifted a heavy watering can, his coat caught against a broken gate hinge. The sleeve Eleanor had repaired tore again. A long rip stretched across the worn fabric. He smiled to himself. So much for careful stitching. A familiar voice answered behind him. It is not the stitching's fault. He turned. Eleanor stood beneath a dark blue umbrella. The cloth itself has grown too old. She looked at the damaged sleeve. May I repair it once more? You've done enough already. I disagree. She led him toward the shelter of the old potting shed. Rain drummed gently upon the wooden roof. The world outside softened beneath silver curtains of water. Eleanor removed her sewing kit once again. You truly carry that everywhere. She smiled. My aunt says I spend half my life mending things, and the other half trying to prevent them from breaking. The Duke chuckled quietly. You possess an unusual gift. What gift? You notice what others overlook. She threaded the needle. My father once told me that neglected things often need us most. She worked carefully. Her fingers moved with practiced patience. Neither hurried the silence. Finally, the Duke asked the question that had rested quietly in his heart since yesterday. Miss Hartwell, she glanced up. Why do you continue helping someone everyone else ignores? Her answer came as naturally as breathing. Because a person's worth should never depend upon how they are dressed. The rain continued falling. The Duke said nothing for several moments. He simply looked at her, then nodded slowly. My dear young lady. His voice grew softer than ever. I hope no one ever teaches you otherwise. She smiled. I do not think they could. There was no pride in the answer, only certainty. She believed kindness the way others believed the sun would rise, without question, without condition. The Duke looked toward the rain beyond the doorway. Months ago, he had begun this journey, searching for evidence against one woman. Instead, he kept discovering reasons to admire another. That evening, candles glowed throughout the drawing room. Guests gathered for music. Lady Cecilia entertained them beautifully. She played the pianoforte with flawless technique. Applause filled the room. She accepted every compliment gracefully. The performance was perfect, almost too perfect. The Duke watched from the servants' entrance carrying fresh firewood. Beauty, talent, charm. She possessed them all, yet something remained absent, something no audience could applaud into existence. Compassion. Across the room, Eleanor quietly noticed an elderly guest struggling to reach his walking stick. Without interrupting the music, she crossed the room, retrieved it, placed it gently into his hand, then returned to her chair without expecting acknowledgement. The old gentleman smiled gratefully. Few others even noticed. The Duke did, every single time. As the evening drew to a close, Julian stood alone beside one of the great windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. Lady Cecilia was surrounded by admirers, laughing, receiving compliments. Perfect as ever, his eyes wandered almost absent-mindedly across the room. They settled upon Eleanor. She was helping two exhausted maids clear empty teacups after the gathering. No one had asked her. She simply noticed they were struggling. Julian watched quietly. Something stirred inside him. Not love, not attraction. Something smaller. A question. One that refused to disappear. Why did kindness seem so effortless for Eleanor, and so carefully performed by Cecilia? He frowned slightly. The thought unsettled him. Across the room, the disguised Duke noticed the expression on his son's face. For the first time, Julian was beginning to see, not clearly, not completely, but enough for doubt to take its first quiet breath. And once doubt entered the heart, the carefully crafted mask Lady Cecilia had worn for so long would become much harder to keep in place. Morning sunlight spilled across the windows of Ashbourne Manor. The storm had passed. The gardens shimmered with droplets of rain. Fresh roses bowed beneath the weight of crystal-clear dew. To anyone arriving at the estate, it looked like the picture of peace. Inside, the Duke knew better. For 3 days he had watched. He had listened. He had spoken little, and learned much. Lady Cecilia possessed every accomplishment society admired. She danced beautifully, played the pianoforte flawlessly, spoke with perfect refinement. She charmed titled guests with effortless grace. Yet every act of kindness she offered seemed carefully measured, as though compassion itself were another ornament to be displayed before the right audience. Miss Eleanor Hartwell possessed none of Lady Cecilia's dazzling reputation, yet wherever she walked, fear became comfort, weariness became hope, silence became peace. The contrast grew clearer with every passing hour. Now, the Duke's attention turned elsewhere. Lady Cecilia's character was no longer his only concern. There remained one question far more painful to answer. What kind of Duke would his own son become? The servants had barely finished breakfast when raised voices echoed from the front courtyard. The old beggar stepped outside. Several footmen stood near the entrance. One of them laughed as another held up the Duke's patched cap. "Perhaps we should throw it into the pond." The others chuckled. "It would improve the smell." Another servant nudged the old man's shoulder. "You've stayed long enough." The Duke looked at them quietly. "If I have caused inconvenience, I shall leave after today's gathering." The youngest footman smirked. "Why wait?" He tossed the cap onto the gravel. It landed several feet away. The others laughed again. The Duke simply walked toward it, slowly, calmly. He had taken only 2 steps when another voice interrupted. "That will be enough." The laughter stopped immediately. Viscount Julian Ravenshire crossed the courtyard. He had witnessed only the last few moments. His expression remained composed, but disappointed. He looked first at the servants, then at the old beggar. "There is no honor in mocking an elderly man." The footmen lowered their eyes. "We meant no harm, my lord. Harm is not always measured by intention." Julian retrieved the cap himself. He brushed away the dust before offering it to the old man. "My apologies." The Duke accepted it with a grateful nod. "You are very kind, sir." Julian smiled politely. "I have merely done what any gentleman should." The servants quietly dispersed. For a brief moment, the Duke felt a measure of pride. His son possessed kindness. His mother had raised him well. His tutors had taught him honor. His heart remained generous. Yet as Julian turned to leave, Lady Cecilia appeared upon the terrace. "There you are." Her smile instantly captured his attention. "I've been looking everywhere." Julian's concern vanished as quickly as it had come. He offered the old man one final courteous nod before joining her. Lady Cecilia glanced briefly toward the beggar, then looked away as though he had ceased to exist. She slipped her arm through Julian's. "There are guests waiting." Together, they disappeared into the manor. The Duke watched them go. His eyes lingered upon his son. Julian had seen cruelty. He had corrected servants, but he had never questioned the woman standing beside him. He mistook courtesy for courage. The difference troubled the Duke deeply. A gentleman could stop another man's cruelty. A future Duke had to confront it, even when it wore a beautiful smile. Inside the library, Julian searched for a volume of poetry he had promised to lend Lady Cecilia. Instead, he found Eleanor standing upon a small wooden stool. She reached toward the highest shelf. The book remained just beyond her fingertips. Julian smiled. I believe the shelf has declared victory. Startled, Eleanor looked over her shoulder. It appears so. Allow me. He reached up effortlessly and removed the leather-bound volume. Thank you. He handed it to her. I owe you one. I believe we're even. She looked puzzled. You recommended that collection of poems yesterday. Julian smiled. I found myself reading half of it before retiring, and I understood perhaps every third verse. She laughed softly. That is more than most gentlemen admit. He laughed with her. The sound echoed gently through the quiet library. For the first time in many months, conversation required no effort. No performance, no careful choice of flattering words. They wandered slowly between the towering bookshelves. Their discussion drifted naturally. History, music, travel, architecture, the responsibilities carried by old families. Julian found himself asking questions simply because he wished to hear her thoughts. Eleanor never tried to impress him. She simply answered honestly. I've always admired old libraries, she said quietly. They remind us that wisdom survives long after wealth changes hands. Julian paused. That's beautifully said. My father believed books were conversations across generations. He sounds like a remarkable man. He was. A brief silence followed. Not awkward, comfortable. Julian realized something surprising. Time seemed to pass differently around Eleanor. Slower, calmer. He had never noticed such peace before. A servant appeared in the doorway. My lord, Lady Cecilia requests your company in the drawing room. Julian blinked. I had no idea we'd been talking so long. Neither had Eleanor. She closed her book. I should return to my aunt. Julian hesitated. I've enjoyed this. So have I. She offered a warm smile before quietly leaving the library. Julian remained where he was, looking toward the doorway through which she had disappeared. A strange thought entered his mind. He could not remember the last conversation that had ended so naturally, without effort, without pretense, without anyone trying to impress the other. The disguised Duke had witnessed everything. From the corridor beyond the library, he had paused while carrying fresh logs for the drawing-room fire. He had not intended to eavesdrop, but neither had he wished to interrupt. He noticed something subtle. Julian smiled differently around Eleanor. Less dazzled, more relaxed. Lady Cecilia inspired admiration. Eleanor inspired peace. The distinction mattered, even if his son had not yet recognized it. That afternoon, Lady Cecilia hosted several ladies for tea in the South Garden. Conversation flowed easily. Fashion, operas, country houses, future engagements. Lady Cecilia accepted every compliment with perfect grace. My dear, one elderly countess remarked, the Duchess of Ravenshire will suit you splendidly. Lady Cecilia lowered her eyes modestly. You are too kind. The ladies smiled approvingly. No one questioned her humility. No one saw what happened after they departed. A maid accidentally brushed against the tea table. One porcelain cup tipped over. Tea spilled across the embroidered cloth. Lady Cecilia's pleasant expression vanished instantly. Must every task become a disaster? I'm terribly sorry, my lady. You always are. The maid reached trembling hands toward the cloth. Lady Cecilia pulled it away. Leave it. I shall clean it immediately. You have already done enough. The young maid lowered her head. Yes, my lady. She hurried away, fighting tears. Only one person followed her. Eleanor. The Duke watched from beneath a nearby oak tree. Again, without hesitation, without seeking recognition, she comforted the frightened girl before helping replace the tea service herself. No one praised her. She had expected no praise. That made the kindness worth even more. As evening settled over Ashbourne Manor, the household gathered for music once again. Candles flickered beneath crystal chandeliers. A violinist filled the drawing room with gentle melodies. Guests spoke quietly over wine. The Duke remained near the servants' entrance, invisible, observing. Julian entered the room. His eyes instinctively searched for Cecilia. He found her surrounded by admirers, laughing beautifully. Every gentleman listened. Every lady admired her elegance. Then, almost without thinking, his gaze wandered elsewhere. Eleanor stood near the fireplace, helping an elderly guest locate his spectacles. She smiled as she handed them over. The old gentleman laughed warmly. Julian found himself smiling too. He did not understand why, only that the smile came naturally. Across the room, Lady Cecilia noticed where he was looking. Her expression hardened for the briefest moment. Then, it disappeared beneath another perfect smile. The Duke saw both expressions, the practiced one and the genuine one beneath it. One lasted for the guests, the other escaped only when she believed no one important was watching. She remained unaware. The least important man in the room was the one observing her most carefully. Late that night, the Duke stood alone beneath the stars outside the manor. Moonlight silvered the gardens. Somewhere inside, laughter still echoed through the grand halls. He leaned quietly upon his weathered walking stick. His thoughts lingered on his son. Julian was not weak because he lacked kindness. He was weak because he feared disturbing the happiness he believed he had found. He corrected strangers, yet remained silent when the woman he loved caused pain. Love had not corrupted his judgment, it had blinded it. The realization saddened the Duke more than Lady Cecilia's cruelty ever had. For cruelty could be exposed, blindness had to be healed. He lifted his eyes toward the brightly lit windows of Ashbourne Manor. The truth was drawing closer. Lady Cecilia's mask had begun to crack. Julian's certainty had begun to waver. And somewhere between those two quiet changes, the future of House Ravenshire had already begun to shift. Neither of them knew it yet, but the day everyone awaited was almost here. Morning broke over Ashbourne Manor, with the quiet certainty of history about to be written. Golden light spilled across the eastern lawns. Freshly cut roses lined the stone steps. White ribbons fluttered gently from the columns overlooking the courtyard. Servants hurried in every direction. Footmen polished brass until it gleamed like gold. Housemaids swept the entrance hall for what seemed the 10th time. The cook barked orders from the kitchens. Musicians tuned violins beneath the portico. Every clock inside the manor seemed to count toward one moment, the arrival of His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshire, or so everyone believed. Only one man knew the Duke had been living beneath their roof for days, and he stood quietly beside the stable yard, wearing patched wool, leaning upon a weathered walking stick, watching, waiting. Lady Margaret Ashbourne surveyed the courtyard with obvious satisfaction. Excellent. She adjusted the arrangement of white lilies beside the entrance. The Ravenshire household must find everything flawless. A footman bowed. Yes, my lady. She turned toward another servant. The musicians begin the moment the first carriage appears. Yes, my lady. And someone see that the old beggar remains out of sight. The words were spoken almost casually, as though discussing unwanted furniture. The stable master shifted uneasily. He has caused no trouble. Lady Margaret barely looked at him. I did not ask whether he had. I asked that he not be seen. The stable master lowered his head. As you wish. The disguised Duke smiled faintly. He had spent a lifetime issuing instructions. He recognized the difference between authority and arrogance. Inside her chambers, Lady Cecilia stood before an enormous mirror. A maid carefully fastened the final pearl into her hair. Today, everything had to be perfect. The pale silver gown she had chosen shimmered softly whenever she moved. Its embroidered sleeves caught the morning light like frost upon glass. Lady Margaret entered carrying a velvet jewel case. You look every inch a future duchess, Lady Cecilia smiled. I intend to. Lady Margaret opened the case. Inside rested a magnificent sapphire brooch. It belonged to your grandmother. She pinned it carefully to Cecilia's gown. Wear it today. Cecilia admired herself once more. Do you think the Duke will approve of me? Lady Margaret met her daughter's eyes through the mirror. My dear, she smiled knowingly. Powerful men admire confidence. And if he proves difficult, Lady Margaret adjusted one final strand of hair. He is old. The words came quietly. So is his generation. They care about appearances. We shall give him exactly what he expects to see. Neither woman noticed the elderly gardener trimming hedges just beyond the open window. Neither realized. Every word reached him clearly. The Duke continued clipping roses. His expression never changed, but another piece of the puzzle quietly settled into place. By midday, guests filled the gardens. Elegant ladies strolled beneath flowering arches. Gentlemen discussed estates and parliament. Laughter floated across the lawns. Lady Cecilia moved gracefully among them. She greeted everyone warmly, complimented dresses, remembered names, listened attentively. If someone had arrived that very moment, they would have sworn she possessed the gentlest heart in England. The Duke watched silently. He had almost begun to admire the perfection of the performance. Almost. Then, a young maid carrying lemonade stumbled on the garden path. One crystal glass slipped from the tray. It shattered against the stones. Conversation stopped. The maid immediately fell to her knees. "My deepest apologies, my lady." Lady Cecilia's smile vanished. "You've embarrassed me before my guests." "I didn't mean." "You rarely do." The frightened girl reached toward the broken glass. Lady Cecilia stepped back as though avoiding contamination. "Someone else clean this." The maid's hands trembled. "I'm terribly sorry." Lady Cecilia turned away. "I grow exhausted by apologies," she resumed, smiling before reaching the nearest guests. "So terribly clumsy." The transition was flawless. Within seconds, the gracious hostess had returned. The Duke watched in silence. He no longer doubted what kind of woman stood before him. Moments later, Eleanor quietly approached the kneeling maid. "Don't move." The girl looked up in confusion. "There are sharp pieces." Eleanor carefully gathered the broken crystal herself, then offered the trembling servant her hand. "Are you hurt?" The maid shook her head. "Only frightened." Eleanor smiled gently. "That can be mended." The frightened girl managed a tiny laugh. The Duke noticed. Kindness always seemed to leave people lighter than it found them. Nearby, Julian had witnessed the entire exchange. Not all of it, only enough. He had seen the broken glass. He had heard Cecilia's sharp tone, then watched Eleanor comfort the maid afterward. A quiet unease settled over him. "Cecilia," she turned with another polished smile. "Yes, perhaps she deserves forgiveness." Lady Cecilia blinked. "For breaking crystal, for making a mistake." Lady Cecilia laughed softly. "My dear Julian." She slipped her hand through his arm. "If servants are never corrected, they never improve." Julian hesitated. "I suppose." He wanted to say more. He did not. The Duke watched from beneath an elm tree. Again, courtesy had yielded to silence. Again, his son had chosen peace over principle. The distinction hurt more than Julian could imagine. The afternoon passed beneath growing anticipation. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward the front gates. Every distant carriage caused excitement, only to fade into disappointment. "The Duke should have arrived by now. I heard he traveled from Ravenshire Abbey yesterday." Perhaps the roads delayed him. No doubt he'll appear before supper. The conversations repeated endlessly. The old beggar sat quietly upon a wooden bench beneath the great oak, listening, smiling faintly. No one imagined. The man they impatiently awaited had been sitting among them all along. Late in the afternoon, the sky brightened after passing clouds. A distant sound rolled across the countryside. Hooves. Many hooves. The stable boys looked toward the road. One servant hurried onto the terrace. "My lady!" Lady Margaret straightened instantly. "What is it?" Carriages. Every conversation stopped. Guests rose from their chairs. Ladies adjusted gloves. Gentlemen buttoned their coats. Musicians hurried into position. Footmen formed two perfect lines along the entrance steps. Lady Cecilia took one slow breath, then practiced her curtsy. Once, twice, a final time. Lady Margaret nodded approvingly. "Perfect." Julian smiled nervously. "My father dislikes ceremony." Lady Margaret answered smoothly. "Even modest men deserve proper respect." The rumble grew louder, then louder still. Dust rose beyond the iron gates. At last, the first carriage appeared. Black, elegant. Its polished panels reflected the afternoon sun. Upon its door, the Ravenshire crest gleamed in brilliant gold. A second carriage followed, then a third, then another. An entire procession rolled through the gates. Guests whispered excitedly, "The Duke! His Grace has arrived!" The Ravenshire household. The musicians began to play. Footmen stood straighter. Lady Cecilia's smile became radiant. Everything she had imagined, everything she had rehearsed, had finally arrived. The first carriage stopped before the great staircase. Silence settled across the courtyard. A liveried footman opened the carriage door. The Chief Steward descended first. Tall, distinguished, silver-haired. Every servant at Ashbourne Manor recognized the Ravenshire livery immediately. Lady Margaret stepped forward. Lady Cecilia lowered herself into a flawless curtsy. "Welcome to Ashbourne Manor." The Chief Steward acknowledged neither greeting. He removed his gloves slowly, looked across the assembled guests, then began walking, past Lady Margaret, past Lady Cecilia, past the county's most distinguished families, past Viscount Julian Ravenshire himself. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd. "Where is he going?" Lady Cecilia frowned. "Surely, He had mistaken someone. The chief steward continued walking, without hesitation, without uncertainty, straight toward the elderly beggar seated quietly beneath the great oak. The courtyard seemed to stop breathing. The old man slowly rose to his feet, leaning upon the same weathered walking stick Eleanor had returned to him days before. The chief steward stopped before him, removed his hat, then bowed, deeply, more deeply than he had bowed to any sovereign official in years. His voice carried clearly across the silent courtyard. Only 2 words. Your Grace. Silence. Absolute silence. A wine glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered unnoticed upon the stones. Lady Cecilia's smile disappeared. Lady Margaret's face drained of colour. Julian stared without blinking. The old beggar, the weary traveller, the elderly man they had mocked. The stranger everyone believed beneath notice, slowly lifted his eyes, and for the first time since arriving at Ashbourne Manor, his posture changed. His shoulders straightened. His quiet presence suddenly filled the entire courtyard. No one spoke. No one moved. No one dared breathe. The truth had finally arrived. Your Grace. The 2 words seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken. No one moved. No one breathed. The cheerful melody the musicians had been playing faded into an uneasy silence. The courtyard of Ashbourne Manor, so full of laughter only moments before, became as still as a cathedral. Every pair of eyes turned toward the old beggar, toward the weary man in patched wool, toward the stranger Lady Cecilia had struck across the face only 3 days earlier. The chief steward remained bowed, his head lowered with the reverence due only to one of England's highest noblemen. Your Grace, he repeated, his voice unwavering. Your household has arrived. The old man closed his eyes briefly. Then, with measured calm, he removed the weathered cap from his silver hair. For the first time, everyone saw him clearly. The stooped shoulders straightened. The weary posture disappeared. The quiet old traveller seemed to gain several inches in height without taking a single step. His calm grey eyes swept slowly across the stunned faces before him. No anger, no triumph, only profound disappointment. The disguise had hidden his clothing. It had never hidden his dignity. A horrified whisper escaped one of the guests. The Duke. Another lady pressed a trembling hand against her lips. My heavens! Lady Margaret staggered backward. This cannot be. Her carefully composed expression collapsed completely. Lady Cecilia felt the blood drain from her face. She stared at the man she had humiliated, the man she had called filthy, the man she had struck, the man whose walking stick she had kicked across the courtyard. Her knees suddenly felt weak. Julian remained frozen where he stood. His eyes searched the Duke's face desperately, looking for some sign that this was impossible, some explanation, some mistake. Instead, he found only the unmistakable face of his father. Recognition struck him like lightning. Father. The word barely escaped his lips. The Duke looked at him. His expression softened for only the briefest moment. Then the sadness returned. You walked past me 3 times. Julian lowered his eyes. You never once truly looked. The words were spoken quietly. They cut deeper than any shout ever could. Lady Cecilia suddenly stepped forward. Your Grace! Her voice trembled. If I had known. The Duke slowly raised one hand. She fell silent immediately. He had not spoken. He had not frowned. Yet somehow, the simple gesture carried more authority than any angry command. If you had known. His voice remained calm. What would have changed? Lady Cecilia opened her mouth. No words came. Would she have offered kindness, or merely courtesy to a duke? The answer stood plainly before everyone. She looked helplessly toward her mother. Lady Margaret quickly recovered enough composure to speak. Your Grace, this has all been a dreadful misunderstanding. We welcomed every guest with the greatest respect. The Duke regarded her steadily. Did you? Lady Margaret forced a smile. Certainly. The Duke nodded once, then turned toward the assembled servants. His gaze rested upon faces that had avoided meeting his eyes for days. Footmen, housemaids, kitchen staff, stable boys, gardeners, people who had witnessed everything. He spoke only one sentence. Tell me. A long silence followed. How was your guest treated? No one answered. The servants looked nervously at one another. Several glanced toward Lady Cecilia. Others lowered their heads. Fear lingered in the courtyard. The Duke waited patiently. He had never believed truth should be hurried. Finally, the stable master stepped forward. He removed his cap. "Your Grace," his voice shook. "You were given shelter in the servants' quarters." The Duke nodded. "I was. You thanked us for it." "I did." The stable master swallowed hard. "And you deserved far better." Silence. Then, another voice. Emily, the young maid Eleanor had comforted more than once. She stepped forward with trembling hands. "My lady struck you." Lady Cecilia closed her eyes. Emily continued. "Your sleeve brushed her gown. You apologized." Then she removed her glove. The young maid hesitated. The memory clearly pained her. "And struck your face." Several guests gasped. Many had seen it. Few had imagined they would one day hear it spoken aloud before the Duke himself. Lady Cecilia shook her head desperately. "I was startled." "I acted without thinking." The Duke did not even look at her. He continued watching the servants. A footman stepped forward next. "I shoved your Grace when Lady Cecilia ordered me to remove you." Another servant lowered his head. "I kicked your walking stick." I laughed. "I am deeply ashamed." One by one, they came forward, each confession adding another stone to the weight already crushing the courtyard. A kitchen maid spoke of Lady Cecilia mocking exhausted servants. A gardener recalled hearing Lady Margaret order that the beggar remain hidden before the Duke's arrival. Another footman admitted throwing the Duke's cap into the gravel while others laughed. No one exaggerated, no one invented. They simply told the truth, exactly as it had happened. The silence afterward felt unbearable. At last, the Duke turned toward Eleanor. She stood quietly near the edge of the gathering, almost wishing to disappear. "Miss Hartwell," she stepped forward. "Your Grace, you believed me to be a beggar." "I did." "You offered me food." "Yes." "You repaired my coat." "Yes." "You returned my walking stick." "Yes." "You spoke to me with kindness." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I only treated you as I hoped someone would treat my own father." The Duke smiled gently. "The answer has not changed." She looked up in confusion. "What answer, Your Grace?" "The one you gave me beneath the potting shed." His voice carried across the silent courtyard. "A person's worth should never depend upon how they are dressed." Several guests looked toward Eleanor with newfound respect. Others looked toward Lady Cecilia with growing discomfort. The contrast between the two women had never appeared so striking. Julian could bear the silence no longer. He stepped toward his father, then stopped halfway. He suddenly felt like a small boy again, ashamed, uncertain. "I have failed you." The Duke looked at him quietly. "You failed to recognize me." Julian nodded. "Yes, but that is not what grieves me most." Julian looked up. "You saw enough." The Duke's voice remained steady. "You saw servants mocking an old man. You stopped them. For that, I am proud." Julian's shoulders lifted slightly. Then the Duke continued. "But you never questioned why the woman you intended to marry treated that same old man with such contempt." Julian's hope disappeared. "You mistook politeness," the Duke said softly, "for moral courage." Julian closed his eyes. Every moment replayed in his mind. The broken crystal, the frightened maids, the harsh words, the glove, the walking stick. Eleanor quietly comforting those Lady Cecilia had wounded. The signs had always been there. He simply had not wished to see them. "I loved who I believed she was." The Duke nodded. "I know. And that is why I blame blindness." He paused. "Not your heart." Julian looked at his father with tears gathering in his eyes. "I am sorry." The Duke rested one hand gently upon his son's shoulder. A painful lesson often becomes the wisest teacher. Lady Cecilia suddenly fell to her knees. "Your Grace, please." Her carefully rehearsed elegance had vanished completely. "I beg you to forgive me. I lost my temper. I never imagined—" "No," the Duke interrupted quietly. "You never imagined that the old man mattered." She burst into tears. "I can change." The Duke regarded her for a long moment. "I hope you do." His answer surprised everyone. There was no cruelty, no humiliation, only truth. "I sincerely hope you become the woman you have spent so many years pretending to be." Lady Cecilia lowered her head. She could not answer. For the first time in her life, beauty offered no protection. Charm carried no influence. Status meant nothing. Only character remained, and hers had already spoken. The Duke turned slowly toward the assembled guests. Many looked ashamed for remaining silent. Others refused to meet his eyes. His voice carried calmly across the courtyard. A title commands respect. He looked toward Eleanor. But kindness earns it. No one argued. No one could. Because every person standing there had witnessed the difference. Not in a ballroom, not during a speech, but in the smallest moments. A glove, a walking stick, a bowl of warm broth, a repaired sleeve. Simple acts, quiet choices. The true measure of nobility had never depended upon wealth, only upon the heart, willing to extend compassion when no reward could possibly follow. The truth had stood up that afternoon, and nothing at Ashbourne Manor would ever be the same again. Silence lingered over Ashbourne Manor long after the Duke's words had faded. No one seemed willing to move. No one wished to be the first to break the stillness. The grand courtyard, where servants had hurried and guests had laughed only moments before, now felt strangely unfamiliar. The truth had changed it. His Grace Duke Edmund Ravenshire stood quietly beside his weathered walking stick. The patched coat still rested upon his shoulders. The disguise no longer mattered. Everyone now saw the man beneath it. More importantly, they had seen themselves. Lady Cecilia remained on her knees. Tears streaked the carefully applied powder on her cheeks. The perfect image she had spent years constructing had collapsed in a single afternoon. She looked toward Julian. "Please," her voice trembled. "Tell him." Julian did not answer. He could not. He remembered every conversation they had shared, every promise, every dream of their future together. He had believed he knew the woman standing before him. Now, he realized he had fallen in love with an illusion. Lady Margaret stepped forward instead. "Your Grace." She struggled to recover the confidence that had never before deserted her. "My daughter made mistakes. We all do. Surely one unfortunate afternoon should not destroy two families." The Duke regarded her with quiet patience. "One afternoon?" He shook his head gently. "No, Lady Margaret. This was not one afternoon. It was many years of choices, revealed in one afternoon." The older woman's composure faltered. "We taught Cecilia to value her future. You taught her to value a title." The Duke's words were calm. "But you forgot to teach her how to deserve one." Lady Margaret lowered her eyes. For the first time in many years, she had no answer. The Duke turned toward Julian. "My son." Julian stepped forward immediately. He looked less like a viscount than a young boy awaiting judgment. "I have disappointed you." The Duke rested one hand upon his shoulder. "You have disappointed yourself." Julian nodded slowly. "Yes, I ignored what stood before me. You wished to believe the best. I did. There is no shame in hoping for goodness." The Duke smiled sadly. "The danger lies in refusing to see its absence." Julian looked toward Cecilia. She was still weeping. "I kept making excuses." The Duke nodded. "You mistook beauty for virtue. You mistook refinement for kindness. And you mistook affection." He paused. "For wisdom." Julian lowered his head. "I understand now." "Do you?" Julian looked up. "I do. My future wife should make the people around her feel safer, not smaller." The Duke smiled. For the first time since revealing himself, a flicker of pride returned to his eyes. "You have learned, and painful lessons are often remembered longest." He slowly faced Lady Cecilia. She rose unsteadily to her feet. Hope flickered across her face. Perhaps there was still a chance. "Your Grace, I truly care for Julian." The Duke listened without interruption. "I know how this appears, but I can change. I promise." The Duke remained silent for several moments. Then, he spoke with the same calm voice that had carried through every difficult moment since arriving at Ashbourne Manor. "I believe people can change." Lady Cecilia's eyes brightened. "But change begins with truth." Her hope faded. "You have spent years becoming the woman society wished to admire." He looked steadily into her eyes. "You have spent very little time becoming the woman your conscience wished you to be." She began crying again, not loudly, quietly. The kind of tears that come when excuses finally disappear. The Duke continued, "I do not condemn you. I pity you. Because somewhere along the way, you came to believe that kindness belonged only to those who could repay it." He looked toward Eleanor. "You were taught that power creates greatness. Miss Hartwell understands that greatness creates responsibility. The difference is everything." He turned toward the assembled guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you clarity." No one spoke. The engagement between Viscount Julian Ravenshire and Lady Cecilia Ashbourne is ended. A collective gasp swept through the courtyard. Several ladies exchanged shocked glances. One gentleman removed his spectacles as though he had misheard. Lady Margaret closed her eyes. Years of ambition, gone. Not through scandal, not through gossip, but through truth. The Duke continued. No marriage founded upon appearance can survive. Only one founded upon character deserves to endure. Lady Cecilia lowered her head. She offered no protest. At last, she understood that no argument could repair what pride had destroyed. Word traveled astonishingly fast. By evening, the neighboring estates had already begun whispering. By the following morning, the story had reached London. Not that Lady Cecilia had lost a duke, but why? Society, so often dazzled by appearances, now repeated a different tale. The beautiful lady who struck an old beggar, the humble stranger who proved to be one of England's most respected noblemen, the orphaned cousin who alone had shown compassion. Ashbourne Manor grew strangely quiet. Visitors found reasons to postpone calls. Invitations ceased. Lady Margaret, who had spent decades climbing society's ladder, discovered how quickly that ladder could disappear beneath one's feet. The Duke had spoken no word against them. He had not needed to. Character had spoken loudly enough. Later that afternoon, the Ravenshire carriages stood ready to depart. Trunks had been packed. Servants loaded luggage beneath the watchful eyes of the Chief Steward. Julian approached his father. "I have one final request." The Duke looked at him. "If you permit, I should like to apologize to someone else." The Duke smiled faintly. "I believe that is long overdue." Julian crossed the courtyard. Eleanor stood near the rose garden speaking quietly with Emily, the young maid. When she saw him approaching, she curtsied politely. "My lord." Julian shook his head. "No. Today, I believe I have earned only my name." She looked at him kindly. "Very well." He hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I owe you an apology." She seemed surprised. "For what?" "I saw your kindness. Again and again. I admired it, without understanding it. I should have listened more carefully. You were seeing things long before I was." Eleanor smiled gently. "There is nothing to forgive." "There is." He looked toward the gardens. "I searched for grace in the brightest ballroom." His voice grew quieter. "I never noticed it standing quietly beside me." Eleanor said nothing. She simply smiled with the warmth that had comforted frightened servants and weary strangers alike. Not because she sought praise, but because forgiveness came as naturally to her as kindness. The Duke watched the exchange from across the courtyard. Then, he walked toward Eleanor himself. She immediately curtsied. "Your Grace." He shook his head softly. "I have spent the past week receiving kindness from you. You owe me no ceremony." She smiled. "Old habits are difficult to break. So are good ones." He reached into the pocket of his coat, the patched coat, the one she had mended twice. From inside, he withdrew an elegant cream-colored envelope, bearing the Ravenshire seal. "I have something for you." She accepted it carefully. Inside lay a handwritten invitation. Her eyes widened as she read. "Miss Eleanor Hartwell, the doors of Ravenshire Abbey will always be open to you as an honored guest and cherished friend of our family." She looked up. "Your Grace, I scarcely know what to say." "Then allow me to say something first." He smiled warmly. "I came to Ashbourne Manor, searching for the woman worthy of becoming a duchess." He glanced briefly toward the manor. "I simply looked in the wrong place." Emotion filled Eleanor's eyes. "I have done nothing extraordinary." The Duke shook his head. "That is precisely why you are extraordinary. You never performed kindness. You simply lived it." Weeks passed. Summer settled gently across the countryside. The painful events at Ashbourne Manor slowly gave way to quieter days. At Ravenshire Abbey, ancient stone walls overlooked sweeping gardens filled with lavender, climbing roses, and towering cedar trees. Eleanor accepted the Duke's invitation, not as a future bride, not as a favored guest, simply as a friend. She spent peaceful afternoons exploring the vast library, walking shaded paths through the gardens, speaking with the Duke about history, literature, and the responsibilities carried by old families. Julian often joined them. There were no grand declarations, no hurried courtship, only conversations, shared laughter, long walks beneath ancient oaks, mutual respect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the western hills, Julian and Eleanor paused beside a quiet fountain. The gardens glowed with golden light. Julian smiled. I have been thinking about something father once told me. Eleanor looked at him. He said wisdom often arrives wearing ordinary clothes. She laughed softly. Your father says many memorable things. He does. Julian's expression became thoughtful. I spent months searching for a future duchess in the brightest ballroom. He met her eyes. I should have been looking for the kindest heart. A faint blush touched Eleanor's cheeks. She answered with the same gentle certainty that had guided her from the very beginning. True nobility is never worn like a jewel. She looked across the gardens where the Duke stood watching from a distant terrace. It reveals itself in the smallest moments. When no one believes they are being watched. Julian followed her gaze. His father stood quietly beneath the evening sky, hands resting upon the very walking stick that had once been kicked across the stones of Ashbourne Manor. The Duke smiled, not because his son had lost an engagement, but because he had gained discernment, not because ambition had been defeated, but because character had prevailed. He had set out to discover whether his son had chosen the right bride. Instead, he had discovered the woman who had possessed the heart of a duchess all along. And in that quiet realization, the future of House Ravenshire no longer rested merely upon noble blood, but upon compassion. For titles may command obedience, fortunes may command envy, beauty may command attention, but only kindness commands the heart, the end.